And we are live, or at least I think we are. My name is Joel Silverman. This is Pandemic. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This is a very special episode tonight because we have the one, the only Shawn Ryan with us. He is the creator of a variety of shows that I will mention in my formal introduction momentarily. Before I do, I want to acknowledge our sponsors who you can see across the top. I assure you all that we are using a new program tonight. We tested it all day today, so our audio should be good. And I'm very appreciative to everybody who staggered through with us last night with Pete Lauyanis and Ryan Johnson. Before we go over to Shawn, I have a quick note from our sponsors that I want to acknowledge from Roadmap Writers and from Notes for Execs. Roadmap is an online writer education platform hosted by working industry executives. If you're looking for a real-world solution to help develop, market, and sell your script, visit roadmapwriters.com to learn more. I'll also throw in that they are friends of mine, and I don't think Shawn even knows this, but helped somebody who works for him get her start and get her manager, who also happens to be my manager. Notes for Execs is a company that guides working entertainment executives on how to give better and more effective creative notes. They are now opening their doors to writers as well, who can learn a lot about their own writing through the notes giving process. And this is a really easy one for me to endorse because I was the one who sat in on one of these sessions for executives and said, this has changed how I think about writing. You've got to open this up to writers too. And now my friend Dan, who runs it, is doing just that. And so now, without further ado, I can see folks are starting to tune in. It always takes a few minutes. But I want to welcome everybody to this interview with Shawn. We are into the program properly now. Shawn really has changed the course of television, and it's probably a little too modest to say so, but there was The Shield, and then there was Before the Shield, at least as far as I'm concerned. He also co-created The Unit and Timeless. I know that there will be Timeless fans here tonight, and of course now S.W.A.T. on CBS. So Shawn, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. One quick clarification, just because I believe in accurate titles. David Mamet created The Unit, and I show ran it with him. But I did not co-create that, but just because I want to give Dave all the credit he deserves.
Well, you guys certainly, I can see a lot of both of you having seen your other work in that show, and I don't know exactly how. I know how the marriage came together and how it started. I don't know exactly how it was with two really auteur personalities, but I loved his memo from that came out. And folks, if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google the David Mamet Unit room memo and post it to your wall and hold it as gospel.
Yeah, he was big into memos, and there are some that have never been publicized that unfortunately I don't think I have. So that was not the only memo that Dave sort of handed out during that time. So people got a little glimpse. So it was like being in a master class with him as a professor during that time.
Yeah, that's interesting because I feel like you probably taught each other a lot, bringing different mediums and different sensibilities there.
Well, Dave is an extraordinarily smart guy. I don't know how much I taught him, but I really loved working with him and telling those stories. And he had been a writer hero of mine, and to get a chance to work with him was pretty incredible. And they always say be careful of meeting your heroes, but in that case, I was certainly glad I did.
Cool. And apparently, one of David Mamet's first students, he says he was in his first acting class at NYU, Jerome messages in. So it's we're all disciples of Mamet deep down. And so we were chatting right before we hopped on about a mutual friend of ours, Matt Nix. And I often start these shows with a quote from him that says, great writers don't just write what they know, they write who they are, both by necessity when you're a showrunner and you're just constantly trying to put stuff out, and also by virtue of that being something that makes the writing good. So I'm curious, you're somebody who has had this long and varied career with very different kinds of shows. The Shield, you've got a cop show, you've got a counterterrorism show in The Unit, you've got a sci-fi show in Timeless, you've now got S.W.A.T, which is kind of a cop show, but also it's social drama.
And it's first responder show, but through the eyes of an African American, cop who has one foot in his South Central, South LA community, and another foot with police. It really sort of stemmed from Aaron Thomas, my partner on that show. His idea was, at that time, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter was a real conflict going in the country, and we liked the idea of, building a show around a guy who was a little bit of each, and seeing if there was a way for the country to come together around that.
And I think that it's very effective at that. I was going to ask, and I think that this segues perfectly, what do you see as the through line that is you through all of these shows? Because certainly I would see topicality. There was a huge topicality to The Unit, certainly to S.W.A.T. But what do you think that is core to you that's a through line through all these programs that you infuse as a writer?
That's so hard for me. I always commented that when we were doing The Shield, I always commented that I love to read the reviews because it allowed me to see what the show was actually about. I'm more of an instinctual writer than an intellectual writer. I'm always amazed at how smart so many of the people in my profession are, and how they plan certain things out. I sort of usually realize threads after the fact on things and things that are affecting me. I would say, I guess if there is one thread from The Shield to The Unit and now S.W.A.T, that maybe it's the burden that we put on those who protect us and the price that they pay for being the people that protect us. I'm very interested in that dichotomy of what's it mean to be a hero, and what's the price you pay for being that hero.
Right. You seem to have. Well, so I'm curious then. Before we go on and interrogate that more, do you have a background? Is there something in your background that brought you into questioning the nature of heroism, or is this something that you backed into?
Was I a hero in my younger days? I'd like to think so, but probably
I
not.
realized as I was saying it that's how it was coming out, which is why I stuttered. And
No,
actually, I'm okay with asking it that way. Were you a hero as a young man? Is that?
No, I have a very boring backstory for a writer. I had loving parents, and who put their kids first, and stressed that I get an education, and drove me to every soccer and hockey game that I played in, and I didn't have a father who was a cop who would come home and share all these stories. But I guess I was a reader. I really loved to read, and I'm glad I was born in a generation that didn't have iPads in cars, because my entertainment driving all around was to read books, and I just like to read about people's experiences. And I was always fascinated with, not always, but I was fascinated with de Tocqueville, the French author who came to the United States and wrote about the American experience. And he specifically wrote some things about the Midwest, where I was from, that I thought, wow, this is so accurate. And it's so interesting that it took a French guy in the 19th century to sort of describe to me the Midwest in a way that I understood it. He described it, I think, as like the beating heart of the country. And so I always was open to the idea that you didn't have to be immersed in a certain life to be able to write about it. That if you could observe it, and if you could put your own spin on it, and if you could dissect something in a way that was interesting, then you can write about it. So I was never a cop. The closest thing I got was I worked as student security at my college, for some extra money, walking around with a flashlight and a bib designating myself as campus security. But I never did anything. It wasn't until after the fact, when I was developing the show, The Chicago Code, I spent a couple of nights in Chicago with homicide detectives and actually went out into the street with them and, had a bulletproof vest on and got involved in a chase for a suspect where I found myself in a sort of large car area looking for a suspect going, oh my God, what am I doing? Why am I looking for some suspect? What happens if I actually find him? So no, I didn't have any special background that made me for this, other than I guess I was just always interested in the human condition and always interested in making observations about things. And I would say that there's a character strength and flaw that I kind of have, which is that, I never liked conflict as a child. I always wanted people to get along. And one way I would do that is I would try really hard to understand the other person's point of view. Or if I was a third person in the middle of an argument, I'd say, hey, this person over here thinks this, and you think, that I wanted people to come along. And to do that, I would find myself really trying to understand why people were behaving the way they were, find rationales for why their behavior or what they were saying made sense. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that was sort of my training ground to be a writer, I would say.
It's really interesting. I think that you make a really
cheers, by the way. We do have alcohol.
Yes, and thank you to Shawn. I've asked all of my guests that if they come on and have a glass, I'll have a glass with them, and many don't. So this liberates me to be able to do the same.
Very good.
The reason I said wow when you were talking before just came out involuntarily because de Tocqueville is not a reference that comes up in a lot of these kinds of conversations. And
it makes me sound far more intellectual than I am, because I'm not the kind of person that tends to pretentiously drop the names of 19th century authors, but he did have a specific effect on me. I must have been, 15, 16, 17 years old when I read his book, and I can't remember the title. That shows you how.
Democracy in America.
Thank you.
It had the same effect on me.
And when I read that, so it's not, I'm not usually the wine-sipping de Tocqueville quoting guy, but in this case, so be it.
Yeah. It's good to be able to slip into the point of view of the wine-sipping de Tocqueville guy. So that's interesting to bring that kind of the ability to look into multiple points of view. I feel like that is pretty consistent across your work. I just last night, as a matter of fact, rewatched the Shield pilot just to kind of get myself in the mindset. It had been a long time.
How'd it hold up?
The everything about it that you were in control of, it holds up perfectly. A few of the things that still look, I'm like, oh right, this was 2002. Some time has passed since then.
So old cell phones and things like that.
Cell phones and the title graphics, look a little bit less.
They were always intended to be rough. And in fact, there's a fun story about that. When we were in the editing room on the pilot trying to figure out what should go where, we wanted a break between the end of the teaser and Act 1, but didn't know what it should be. And there were just some plain titles up there. And I said, well, that just feels boring. And our editor, I just sort of said, I don't know what gave me the idea, but I was like, first of all, maybe a font that feels rougher. He found a font that I think ultimately was called Crack House. I think was the name of the font that we used. And I don't know what in my mind, this was pre sort of visual effects houses doing things quickly and easily and cheaply for you. I was like, I don't know, maybe if it was just a little jangly, if it was moving around. And Scott Brazil, who worked on the pilot with me, we went off to dinner. And when we came back, our editor had just put together this thing on his own, sort of in his editing bay. And that's what it ended up being for 7 years. But one reason was we had so little money to make that pilot and to make the show that they'd put in the budget $50,000 to hire a company to do titles for the show. And I was just like, well, why don't we come up with our own titles and spend that $50,000 somewhere else? So I understand why it looks sort of cheap and basic, although I always felt that worked well with the aesthetic of the show.
100% agree. And don't mean to be obsequious. I'm just walking the line here between interviewer and fan. But something that stood out to me and that really jives with what you mentioned about seeing other people's points of view and incorporating that into the writing. There's an amazing interrogation scene that I'm sure you remember, but for the audience, I have to refresh, where the interrogator is trying to find the location of a little girl that's been kidnapped. And so he is sympathizing with this guy who he can tell is a pedophile and presenting that guy's point of view back to him and saying, like, yeah, you know, like, it's just social mores. It's this, it's that. And it's really powerful because obviously you're never on the side of the pedophile, but you're being given just a little bit of a view into a perverse way of thinking. So that certainly tracks. Now, when you're developing, knowing that that is part of your Swiss Army knife, is that something that you try and bring to things, that you say, okay, let's try and put in a counterintuitive view. Let's try and get into the points of view of people that you wouldn't think we would otherwise get into?
A little bit. I'm always looking for a different way in than what you usually see on TV shows. You're referring to a scene where Dutch is sort of talking to this guy, and yeah, he seems to associate with the guy. I think I had done some research or heard about how and listen, I was a huge fan of like Homicide, and Homicide had really interesting interrogation scenes that I think borrowed from or homages, if you want to call them, that we did on The Shield. But what I had sort of learned was that the best way to get people to talk was actually to sympathize with them and to share their viewpoint on life. That the classic, in their face, threatening thing, which we would see often on the show through Vic, wasn't always the most effective way to do things. And so I was fascinated that, with The Shield, I'd seen so many cop shows. I was a big fan of cop shows. The Shield really began because at that point there wasn't a cop show on TV that I loved anymore. I'd loved early seasons of NYPD Blue. I'd loved Homicide, Life on the Street, but that was off the air. Retroactively, because I came to it late, I watched in the 90s, Hill Street Blues. And so I just wanted, to me, I was like, well, what's the cop show I want to watch that I haven't seen before? And so every moment, every scene, everything I could, I was always asking, is there a way to do it that a detective seemingly sympathize about child molestation, essentially. I had been I remember back in the 90s, I don't know what made me go see this movie, and every person I talked to that was like, oh my God, why did you do that? But I'd read some review somewhere. There was a sort of short documentary film, I think it was called Chicken Hawks, and essentially a documentary crew embedded itself with members of NAMBLA, the North American Boy Love Association.
Wow.
That advocates for adult underage sex. Now, obviously, that's a horrific thing to the vast majority of people in the country, and presumably those watching on this thing. What was so interesting and amazing to me about the documentary is that they just presented these people. They didn't, there was no external commentary on them. There was nothing, there was no sort of showing of experts who talk about this. But they really just let these people talk and kind of hang themselves, I guess is the best way to put it. And I that was a movie that I was very affected by. I was like, oh, that's so interesting, that approach. And I think that movie was in my head a little bit when I wrote that scene, that it was more interesting not to have someone externally denounce this behavior, but to bring this guy in. So I appreciate you bringing up that scene. That's one of my favorites from the pilot. And I was always proud that, like, oh, that's a scene that you don't usually see in TV shows.
Right. And I think that that idea of just kind of approaching the characters deadpan where they are without putting the judgment of the writer and letting them hang themselves is a really effective tool.
I think, yeah, if I can interrupt, one of my favorite shows right now, it's only 2 seasons, I don't know if we'll get any more, is Mindhunter on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you see, and that's based on the real life of John Douglas, the FBI profiler. And you see that show utilizes very similar thing. He'll go in and he'll talk to Charles Manson or these serial killers have done these awful things. And he really communicates with them in sort of a very non-judgmental way that to me feels very real to get these people to talk. So you see other examples of it in shows that I like. So I recommend Mindhunters if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, Mindhunters is phenomenally well done. So I'm curious, going back to the beginning of The Shield, because that was a moment you had been, I know, on Nash Bridges,
Mm-hmm.
and were still, kind of on your way up. And then you had the opportunity to make an FX drama, which at the time was like, what? What's an FX drama? What's a basic cable drama? And so
Yeah.
I'm curious, what did that opportunity look like? What was, because you were there, you kind of ushered in this transition into a more sophisticated kind of storytelling that was enabled by cable and by streaming to a certain degree. And so I'm curious how it felt both riding and leading that wave, and what was the experience in that moment, late 90s, early 2000s, launching into something new.
Well, first of all, you have to give credit to shows like Oz and The Sopranos that preceded us, who really did establish that you could do this complex, very adult storytelling on TV. Now, the feeling at the time was HBO was the only place you could do it.
Right.
And so I would say the thing that we changed was that you could do it on basic cable. You could do it while selling ads. And I think the thing that we proved was that HBO didn't have a monopoly on high quality prestige storytelling, I guess is the best way that I can put it. How did it feel at the time? It felt surreal because, as you put it, I was a low-level writer just trying to work my way up, trying not to be fired off the shows I worked on. The reason why The Shield came to be was that I spent 3 years working on Nash Bridges. A phenomenal writing staff, phenomenal mentors in Carlton Cuse and John Worth, who really took their time trying to teach me what I was doing right and what I was doing wrong. But there was a formula to that show. And there was very much, in many ways, because of Don Johnson, our star, who wanted to be viewed very heroically, and he had a lot of clout on the show. There were narrow parameters, which, writing for that show for 3 years, I started to buck against. I started to resist. Now, I couldn't resist it on Nash Bridges. Right. And so what I found was I had this idea for the show that turned out to be The Shield. And I was like, I'm just going to get everything. And I'd gone on police ride-alongs and up in San Francisco for the show and had seen things that, I thought were really super interesting, but were wholly inappropriate for Nash Bridges. And I was like, let me just get it all out in this one script. And then, of course, no one will ever make this show, because the only people that make shows like this are HBO, and they produce their own stuff. So this will never get made, but hopefully it's a good writing sample. And after 3 years of writing Nash as the hero 100% of the time, let me write this guy who's kind of heroic, but also an asshole, and you kind of love him, but you kind of hate him. And I never imagined The Shield, especially the pilot, I would say, is a far darker show than I am as a person. And I did it as a one-time thing to get it out of the way, to just cleanse my palate from Nash. And I'd started to work on Angel for Joss Whedon at that point, because I started writing the pilot while I was still on Nash and sort of finished it when I had started on Angel. but all of a sudden FX wanted to make it, and all of a sudden it became my life for 7 years. And it was interesting because I'm a far happier, more optimistic person than I think that show suggests. And at the beginning, it was hard to believe. Like, when I first got a call about this meeting, I was like, FX, you mean Fox? Like, no, FX. I was like, yeah, I get that cable channel. That's like Beverly Hills 90210 repeats. Like, what are you talking about? They were speaking another language. Like, they don't make TV shows. What are you talking about? And I had to be convinced that, like, just go and meet with them and talk with them. And I met with Kevin Riley and Peter Agori there, and they kind of explained what they were doing. I was like, well, that sounds amazing. That will never work, but okay. I mean, who's going to watch, like, shows on FX? Like, it just made no sense.
Right.
But I was so early in my career and so low on the totem pole that if somebody says, hey, we want to make your show, you're just so excited to make it. Once again, it was like, well, if we can do a good job, of course they'll never make it. And if they make it, no one will ever watch it. But if it's sort of good, maybe that could be a calling card for my next gig. And it wasn't until after season 1 premiered and, got good ratings, great reviews, I was like, oh my God, this might, like, be my life for a few years, which was surprising, but it was surreal. It was utterly unexpected. It didn't match up with how everyone understood the industry to work. There were people there at FX, and, and I've heard stories after the fact about, I wouldn't say resistant, but how skeptical management at News Corp was about this. But they gave Peter and Kevin the rope to hang themselves, and then it worked. And I think there were a lot of people that were shocked. And I give them a lot of credit. And listen, I love getting some of the credit for being the creator of The Shield, but they followed that up with Nip Tuck and then Rescue Me. And so they're very smart about what they were doing. And there was a niche. I always say to writers, like, write the show that's not on TV that you want to watch. And these guys programmed the shows that weren't on TV that they wanted to watch. And there was a gap between these prestige HBO shows that were only on a few months out of the year and network TV at that point, and between subscription, channels like HBO and ad-supported networks. And they, Peter Agori once told me the story that when he went to present this pilot to advertisers in New York and advertiser buyers, that before they ran the pilot for everyone to watch, that he said, listen, before you watch the show, I just want you to ask yourself one question. So this would have been in 2001. And The Sopranos, I think, was in its second or third season at this point. He goes, if you could buy ads on The Sopranos, would you? And then he rolled the pilot of The Shield. So there was this niche that was being unserved, that they were smart enough to notice, and they had found my script and thought it might work for them. But my life changed so dramatically, so quickly. It was crazy. It was nuts. And I still have a hard time believing it because all I wanted to be was a working writer. I didn't want to be a guy that, of course I wanted to be, but I didn't imagine myself being a guy who was, like, changing the face of television with his show, or a guy that would get up at the Golden Globe Awards to accept, the trophy for best drama. That just was, like, incomprehensible to me. And it's still hard to believe because I just wanted to be a working guy. I just wanted to be a guy who could go to work and write things. When I wrote my first episode of Nash Bridges, it premiered on Halloween night, 1997. And I was just like, oh my God, like, there's my name on CBS as writing the episode. I thought that was a pinnacle. I didn't think it got better than that. And so as it got better, it's that broadcast news line where Holly Hunter, says, what do you, or no, it's William Hurt says, what do you do when your reality sort of eclipses your dreams, or something like that? And she says, keep it to yourself. I was just like, oh, gotta keep it to myself. It's just hard to believe.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that feeling from your perspective. I just knew it as an outside viewer. And I think about now how so many people coming up take for granted that they can write those kinds of things that are edgier and that push more boundaries. And I think that there's a wider range of ideas that people feel like they can do now. But still, even so, even people who've been on here who have come up more recently, uh, over and over again, there's some version of this story of something that had built up inside them that they just desperately wanted to tell this story that didn't necessarily make any sense to the industry as it existed and didn't make sense necessarily to their reps or whoever. And then they went and they wrote it, and that was the thing that precipitated the next great launch.
Yeah, Mad Men's a great example of that. HBO passed on the script for Mad Men. Even though Matt had been a writer on The Sopranos, here's the script. But what's a show about, advertising guys in the 1960s? It's nuts. So yeah, there are all these examples, and I actually worry a lot about the business because I think the TV business is starting to become more like film, and film. The film business is essentially, other than big Marvel movies, has essentially destroyed itself over the last 20 years. And now we're applying their methods more. And so many of these projects are starting off with, well, we have this book and this star and this director, and the sixth person being brought on is the showrunner.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to put all this together, and then we're going to bring somebody. And I feel like the batting average for those things is so low. When I look back and think about the shows that were seminal in the last 20 years, the vast majority of them, maybe like Game of Thrones is an exception because it was based on the novels, but the vast examples of this, whether it's prestige cable like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad and The Shield and Mad Men, or whether it's network like Grey's Anatomy. Grey's Anatomy was a passion thing that Shonda Rhimes had. That was a story she had to tell. Matt Weiner had to tell the story of Mad Men. To me, that's the road to success in TV, is to have somebody who has an idea that nobody's had before that they just have to tell. And if properly supported and properly cast and properly produced, those are the shows that become special in my estimation.
I completely agree, and have made the same observation about how movies are, or TV is the new movies. And the internet is kind of the new TV. The internet's what TV used to be.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that we may be seeing coming down the pike is indie TV, in the same way that you had indie movies at a certain point that were really big, and that was the only way that you could make a really cool, interesting, auteur-driven thing. I think that we may see in the next 10 years the emergence of indie TV as a sector that's doing just that.
I'd be shocked if that didn't happen. I was doing a Zoom session yesterday with a joint acting and directing class of students from my alma mater, Middlebury College in Vermont. And they were talking about, asking all the questions that everyone does. There's a sophomore girl who is interested in being a professional actress, and someday all this stuff. And how do you do it? And it seems so intimidating when you're at college, especially in the middle of nowhere, Vermont. But I was just comparing, I went to college 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, really aging myself. And at that time, there was one camera that you could check out for the whole school for all students in film. And then there was one editing bay that was a tape-to-tape thing that you had to reserve, and you could only reserve it for 2-hour sections. And now I was like, you can make movies on your iPhone if you want to. The iPhone cameras are 10 times better than the cameras that we had to use when I was there. If you have friends who are talented that can act, and I saw some really good actors in that thing yesterday. And if you write something that's interesting, why can't you make it for $50 and post it online? Why wouldn't you? People are asking me, well, how do I be a writer? Well, the answer is simple. You write. How do I be an actor? Well, it's simple. You act. You get somebody to write something, and you find a way to produce it. How do I direct? It's simple. You direct. And that used to be very hard and or very expensive to do. Yeah. Now it's not. So how how is there not a rebellion away from the gatekeepers at networks and studios to some person in college getting together with some talented friends and saying, hey, I got an idea. Let me write some scripts and let's sort of film this on the weekend and let's post it. How does that not happen? I'm sure it's already is happening.
It's absolutely happening. I think it's just that it's scaling up and
Right.
becoming potentially profitable. And that's the most exciting thing to me that I see changing in the industry now, where, entertainment is a business like any other. You've got a product and you need to create a product, and then you need a means of distribution for the product, and then you need customers for the product who will buy it. Well, it used to be that there were a very few number of customers, really, and there were and the cost to make it was so high that you needed really significant institutional backing. And all of a sudden, it's like, well, you can create a product, you can distribute it, you can, and then the only issue really becomes monetization. If you make it for cheap enough, then that might not necessarily matter. But there are ways. I see people, the Duplass brothers or whatever, make a little show, flip it to Netflix, flip it to Hulu, flip it to whoever, because they need stuff. And there's more than one game in town.
Well, I was a joint economics major in college, and they'd always talk about, what are the barriers to entry? And usually it's startup costs, right? You're trying to make 1,000 widgets, and the formula is, X being, how much it costs to build the equipment, and then it's, Y times 15 cents per each unit of widget. But the X would always be such a big number, it would be a barrier to entry for people. And that was true of trying to make a movie or trying to make a TV show 30 years ago. Now the barrier of entry, that X number, is so small, it's so little, it's literally almost the time for you to get out of bed and put your phone on, or spend $250 to buy an actual pretty good camera, and then you can edit it on your laptop. I mean, these things, I'm so jealous of this generation. If I'd had access to that kind of equipment when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I would have been out on the college quad filming shit every weekend.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really powerful takeaway, too, for those who are watching and who are on the way up, that even somebody who is, by any account, one of the most successful people inside the existing system is fully endorsing the idea to go and make your own stuff.
Well, that's how you get better.
100%.
I mean, as a writer, when I came out to Los Angeles in 1990, I ended up, I lose count. I'm not sure if it's 16 or 17, but it's one of the two. Let's say 16. I wrote 16 spec scripts before I started getting hired for jobs and getting paid. Right? Some were comedies because I thought I might want to be a comedy writer. Some were dramas. But I kept writing and writing and writing. I kept writing because I was trying to get work. What I didn't know at the time, and I realize now, was that I was writing to become a better writer. So it eventually did lead to employment, but not because of anything other than I grew into the kind of writer that could be employed.
Right. That's a good takeaway quote. Grow into the kind of writer who could be employed. And on that note, I'm going to pause just for a second because I need to do a quick ad break because this is television. And so cheers to that. And to those in the audience, stick around, because after we do this, I'm going to start hopping into your questions, including one. Ryan Johnson, our guest from last night, co-EP on Blind Spot, has a question. Ryan, you're going to be our first one because you suffered through all the technical difficulties last night that made tonight possible. So on that note, I'm going to hop over, do a little sponsorship break. Here I am. I'm taking up the whole screen. And I appear, I do actually have my ad text up. I'm going to get better at this, folks, but thanks for sticking with me. Tonight's episode of PENdemic is brought to you by Roadmap Writers and Notes for Execs. Roadmap is a screenwriting education platform for writers looking for a guided path to success. Programs are hosted online by working industry executives and are designed to empower writers with actionable tools to elevate their craft and cultivate industry relationships. Since 2016, Roadmap has helped more than 113 writers sign to representation, and many others get staffed, optioned, or sell their script. To learn more, visit roadmapwriters.com and use the code PENdemic to save $15. Roadmap Writers, the road to your screenwriting success starts here. And I will also just throw on my personal endorsement. There are a lot of bullshitters in the quote-unquote breaking in space, and they are not them, because I've now known these folks for 5 years. I've seen them help a lot of people, and they just don't make human beings better than Joey Tuccio, the head of Roadmap Writers, especially if you are an orphaned dog. And I mean that literally. He takes and rescues all of them. Notes for Execs is a company that guides working entertainment executives on how to give better and more effective creative notes. Now they are opening their doors to writers as well, who can learn a lot about their own writing through learning about the notes giving process. And once again, I will throw on my personal endorsement there, because I saw Dan Ragusis, who runs Notes for Execs, come into a workshop that I was running, and saw how amazing he was at it, and then saw him deconstruct what a good note is, and then saw him do that with a bunch of execs, and the fact that he's now going to open that up. He's, by the way, running a major development fund, or running development for a major film fund, and the man is the Rain Man of notes giving, but plus a whole great deal of kindness and nurturing too. So notesforexecs.com, roadmapwriters.com, check them out. And now we return to Mr. Shawn Ryan with questions from you all.
Can I say one thing before we get the first question about your sponsors? It occurs to me that, like, in 10 years, will you need to go to film school? Right? Like, you have all the, when you talk about, roadmap writers, that sounds very interesting to me. And, I've been interested in, like, master class that I haven't signed up for yet, but I think I'm going to. David Mamet has a master class on, writing, and Shonda Rhimes has a master class on writing. There's so many assets and opportunities that people have to learn that doesn't require $70,000 a year from these film schools. It'll be interesting to see whether people in the arts, rather than sort of leave with $150,000, $200,000 student loan debts for grad school, why not at least start by looking at some of these sort of opportunities to sort of learn this way? It's interesting to me where this may end up going. That's my only comment.
I think it's a really worthwhile comment, and I also, as I recall, I think that you studied film and economics apparently, but did you go to film school?
No, I was a joint economics and theater major. Now, I took some film classes as part of the theater major, but only like 2 or 3. I was far more focused on theater, so I wrote plays in college. I wrote 3 plays in college. I acted in, 6, 7 plays. I directed a play or 2. So I was very immersed in theater. But as a latchkey kid growing up, who had 2 working parents, my mother was a public school teacher, my father was an accountant. My brother and I would return home from school at around 3 o'clock, 3:30 every day, and my parents would get home till 6. So 3:30 to 6 became rerun time, for the Brady Bunch, the Monkees, the Partridge Family, Beverly Hillbillies. We weren't watching the new episodes, but there would be repeats on in the afternoon. So I was very much a TV kid, and so studying playwriting got me into writing. But very quickly, I segued into wanting to write for TV. But I was not a film major. I still consider myself a person of words more than a person of images. I've chosen never, at least not to this point, I've chosen never to direct, because I always think there's somebody out there that can do it better for me than I would do for myself. I always thought I was going to direct during season 2 of The Shield. I think we held a slot open for me to direct, and then about 3-4 weeks out from doing it, I realized that I had only signed up out of ego, not that I thought it was the best thing for the show. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, I don't need to do this. And so I think I sloughed the episode onto Scott Brazil, and I've never even toyed with the idea of directing since then. So So yeah, I made 3 or 4 student films in college. Once again, they're very rudimentary because of my own lack of skills at that point and because of the lack of quality equipment at the time. Editing was very laborious and the cuts, did not look seamless and everything. But like I did a film version of a short play I'd written. I did a sort of documentary about racism at my college. I did a mock sports thing, a sort of mockumentary thing. But it was all within the scope of a liberal arts education while I was also taking, history and economics classes and everything.
I think that answers a question that a lot of folks often ask, which is, should I go to film school? Do I need to go to film school? And I think that the answer to that is, should you? More complicated question than can be answered in this context. Do you need to? That's clearly you don't necessarily.
You don't need to. It might work for some people. And certainly, what I would say is this: I wouldn't go to film school and leave with a huge student debt.
Yeah.
Not everyone is in the same circumstances, and if your parents can pay for college, good. But I also think this: studying history, say, and economics helped me to be a better writer. Having a liberal arts education as opposed to a very specific film education helped me understand the world in ways that I was able to later translate onto the TV screen, I think.
Yeah.
But every journey is different in Hollywood. And I certainly know people who did go to film school, both for undergrad and grad, who swear by it and love it. And if that's what works for them, then that's what works for them. There is no one way to succeed or to certainly fail in Hollywood.
Well, I don't. There are a lot of folks that I think could speak to all the different ways that one can fail, but that's a different conversation.
No, there's lots of ways to fail. Lots of ways, and a few ways to succeed. Although I do always say, and then I want to get to Ryan's question here, Ryan Johnson, that is,
that every success story I know involves a really great piece of material getting into the hands of someone who has the ability to hire you and the inclination to do so. And if you can just adjust for those 3 things, great piece of material. If somebody just has a ton of inclination because they're your cousin or something, well, that changes the equation. But usually it just means that you got to have something great, and then bit by bit find somebody who can pay you for it. But so Ryan asks, because I know that the audience is going nuts with me not asking their questions. It's just such a fun conversation. If smartphones have made storytelling better or worse, harder or easier?
Worse and harder.
And Ryan, we see on screen here, I don't know if, Shawn, you can see this, very specific question. Does the invention of smartphones, Wow.
No, it's obviously worse because, you're constantly having to explain, like, why someone doesn't just call or text someone information that you want to, withhold from a character, so you make up things like, I got no reception. It's far worse. It chips away at mystery. What's happening here? Well, why don't you just fucking Google it? And so you have to consider all that stuff and the parameters of the story breaking. There are times where you can use cell phones to actually increase the drama. I don't want to act like it never helps, but I would say on the whole, it's really refreshing to watch these movies and TV shows from the 70s and 80s and sort of understand, well, you're not asking yourself, well, why don't you just call someone on your cell? You understand that they are isolated in this moment and have nothing but their wits to get by on. And isn't that more interesting? So it's worse. It's worse. And the question is, will technology advance to the point that it makes all storytelling just silly? And will everything be period pieces back before this technology existed then?
Well, I think that it'll certainly make detective stories harder.
Yes.
Because it's just going to be like,
well, at a certain point, it's just going to be, well, we know you killed her because we tracked your phone and you were there at the time she died.
Right.
And there's, closed circuit TV that shows you entering the apartment. What are the crimes that can actually be committed now that there's not some digital footprint just saying, well, that's who did it?
This is a great idea for a sketch, actually. It's called Law and Order 2040. And it's every episode is 30 seconds. It's like, yep, he was there.
You did it.
Your Honor, he was there.
Right there. We got you.
Yeah. Ryan says, I'm glad we share the same opinion. And so I have a question here. Gosh, I've got so many piled up, folks. I'm sorry. I'm going to catch up as quickly as I can, especially because I know that Shawn's time is limited.
I'll go for as long as you need me to go.
Wow. I appreciate that, and I will be as respectful of that as humanly possible. So Himson asks if you had a moment going back to the Shield where you realized that it was the impact that it was going to have. Did you have a moment when you realized, oh, this is going to change the landscape of television?
Well, I don't know about change the landscape of television. What was glorious about the Shield is that we were able to sort of work anonymously a little bit before our work was judged at all. So we had made the pilot. We filmed 4 episodes, or was it 2 episodes? We filmed, I guess, 2 episodes before the Christmas break in 2001, and then immediately started filming in January. We weren't going to premiere until March of 2002. But Diane Wirtz, who was a reporter, a TV critic, I think for Newsday maybe at that time. I might have the publication wrong, but it was definitely Diane Wirtz. She was the president of the Television Critics Association that year. And we were doing, sometime I think late January, we were doing the TCAs, they call them, where you sort of present your show to the critics and you get on a stage and they ask you questions and everything. And the night before that, they had closed circuit TV in the hotel where they essentially streamed The Shield for any critics that wanted to watch. And right before the TCA, or either right after, I forget which, usually critics will withhold their reviews until like the week before your show premieres. And Diane Wirtz, for whatever reason, chose to write a review in January of a show that wasn't premiering until March. And she was very effusive in her praise. And we felt like we were making something really good, but was in this vacuum. And how do you know for sure? And is it just that we're working on it that we think it's good? And are we mistaken? And she wrote some really glowing things based on the pilot that she'd seen. And that sort of shook things like an earthquake at the FX offices. And I also think it set the tone because she was in this leadership position that year at the TCA. The fact she had written this, I think, set the tone, that these critics should not ignore this little thing that was on FX. And I think they were preconditioned to not hold biases against it for being on FX. And so suddenly that first review was like, oh my God, like we may get some attention. And like I can't remember any of the specifics about the review, but I remember it was a pretty great, glowing review. And then, in the week leading up, the reviews started piling in. Now, interestingly, in the category of, you forget all the good reviews and you only remember the bad ones. It's not like we had bad reviews, but there were only 2 publications I subscribed to at that time. One was the Los Angeles Times, and the other was Entertainment Weekly. And Entertainment Weekly gave us either like a B- or a C+ for the pilot. And Los Angeles Times didn't review it at all. I found out later that the TV critic was very conflicted about the in-your-face nature of the show. And I think he understood that there was some really good stuff there, but I think he was uncomfortable with the material and uncomfortable with, are we really going to put this kind of material on advertised TV? And I think he chose not to do a review. So like all these reviews from other parts of the country were coming in that were very flattering. And then Entertainment Weekly, which came in my mailbox each week, was very meh. and then the Los Angeles Times just wouldn't talk about it at all. And so our batting average was very high, but the ones that sort of mattered to me were not giving us praise. But to answer your question, like the critics, once they saw it and started talking about it, I realized, I didn't know if people would watch it, but I thought that we had achieved everything that was in our power to achieve, that we had made something that was really good, I guess. And so then it aired that Tuesday in March, and and the ratings came in the next day, and they weren't big ratings by network standards, but they were very big ratings by basic cable standards, and I realized that my life had changed.
Wow. And what a crock that for so many people who would have that story now, because I am on a streaming show right now, and we just had our first season come out, and it's like impossible to tell what our ratings are. We're looking at all the metrics, and we're going, wow, we have a lot of retweets, and Amazon says that they're really good, but there's no moment where you look and say, whoa, that was it. The disc flipped.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the secrecy of that. Part of you as a creator might like that, hey, if this is a big failure, no one will really know other than it was canceled. But you wonder what shenanigans are going on in terms of, who's watching and how much they're watching. And it's a little suspicious that they'll cherry pick which ratings they want to share with the town and the industry and which ones they won't.
I had noticed that. And at least with live streams, Facebook, Twitter, and everybody else are going to say exactly how many people watched, and then bit by bit, how that will grow once it lives on the platform. But among the diehards watching right now, VJ wants to know, or wants you to know, this is why I giggled while you were talking, Shawn, that the NFL draft is going great.
I recorded it. First of all, I was a little disappointed. I'm a big football fan. And, I committed to doing this a little while ago. And then when I was looking at my schedule for this week, I was like, oh, no, this is like the same time as the draft. Like, oh, my God. But I have recorded it. Do not have VJ or anyone else tell me who was drafted. I'm going to watch it a little later on tape delay and pretend it's live.
Cool. This reminds me of...
And I'm wearing my Chicago Bears shirt in honor of the NFL draft tonight.
And nobody in the comments, I'm not sure, Shawn, if you have your TV or your screen configured to see the comments, nobody in the comments give anything away. We are all in a cone of silence here.
Very good.
So now Jenny wants to know, let me give you VJ's follow-up. He says he's going to catch up on this live stream later because he's watching the draft right now. All right, VJ.
Understood. I don't blame him. I'd be watching the draft rather than me as well. I would watch me on delay as well.
And I would have been watching before Dan Snyder ruined everything, but that's an entirely different conversation for us to have over an entirely different kind of drink. So Jenny wants to know what your thoughts are on fans getting together for the timeless renewal for season 2.
Well, they should wear masks. They should wear masks and say at least 6 feet apart would be my first thing. Listen, we have to talk about timeless. I've never experienced anything in my life like I've experienced timeless fans. I owe such a debt to the beautifully maniacal feelings that they have for our show. And, I think that there's a little bit of a publicity thing in town where people stir up fans, and really fan reaction has nothing to do with whether a show will get picked up or not. Timeless really is the exception to that story. We would air an episode of Timeless. It would trend #1 on Twitter. When the show initially got canceled, the outrage really did rattle and shake the executives at NBC and made them reconsider, and we were canceled. And then 48 hours later, we were picked up simply because, it was twofold. The fans really made NBC reconsider, and then NBC, having reconsidered, went to Sony, our studio and producer, and said, well, how do we make this happen? And then they worked out a deal economically that worked for both sides. And then when it was canceled a second time, Timeless fans kept, berating the NBC, social media feeds. They didn't want the story to end. They wanted some sort of conclusion. And Bob Greenblatt and Jen Salke, to their credit, they loved the show creatively, and they really did want to give an ending to the fans. And they authorized this 2-hour movie that aired in December of, 2018. And they didn't have to do that. That was not necessarily a moneymaker for them. I think Studio Network both pretty much broke even on it. But really, they did that for the fans. And so having been resurrected twice on Timeless, I refuse to ever believe that it's dead. I think it's sleeping right now. I think Timeless is sleeping. But I think, especially as more fans discover it in this digital age, I do think and hope that there'll be a time when maybe it's a streaming site, maybe something else, sort of say, we'd like fans will turn out for this, and maybe it'll just be a movie. Maybe it'll be a 2-hour streaming movie, or maybe it'll be just a 4-episode thing. Maybe it'll be sporadically every few years, or maybe it will never happen, because I always hate to overpromise to fans and underdeliver. But to me, Timeless is the monster that won't die. And I've been so kind of moved and inspired by the passion that Timeless fans have for the show. And, I know that Eric Kripke and I and the actors, we would be more than willing to, resurrect it in some form, if the appetite was there at some point.
Well, it seems to me, because I remember all that happening and was delighted by it, and the plane at Comic-Con flying by and all this crazy stuff, and it reminded me of the early write-in campaigns to save Star Trek, and
right.
it just feels to me only genre shows inspire this level of passion, and I don't know exactly what it is about genre shows, about fans. I am one of them. Anything that I scroll past on Netflix that has a space backdrop, I'm like, ooh, what's this? And I think that there's just something that's primal, that genre fans are the most intense no matter what, and that we could very easily see a situation 10 years from now, a la Star Trek the Motion Picture, where you have Timeless the Motion Picture, and
right.
It's a big studio movie. It's based on a hot piece of IP, and it's like a theme park ride practically. And then they build out a universe.
You're so right. There's something about the genre world. What's interesting is my brother Jason grew up much more of a genre fan than I did, although I loved like Back to the Future and Star Wars and everything. There are two stories though. Like, we realized that one of the people talking a lot about Timeless online on Twitter was William Shatner, which we sort of blew our mind and everything. And then I was flying up to Vancouver to go to the set of Timeless, and going through security, I saw, oh my God, that's Mark Hamill from Star Wars, right? And with his girlfriend or wife or whoever it was, and we were sitting not exactly in the rows opposite each other, but only one row apart we could see each other. And I was just sitting there sort of doing my work, and I hear him and his significant other start talking about Timeless. Or he heard me. Oh, I think what it was my seatmate was, because I usually don't talk to people on planes unless they talk to me, but this seatmate was particularly curious. Like, oh, who are you? What do you do in life and everything? And I was like, oh, I'm a writer. And, oh, what do you write for? Well, I write for TV. Oh, well, what TV do you write for? And I was like, oh, well, I'm currently working on a show that films up in Vancouver named Timeless. And Mark Hamill heard that, and I was like, oh, we love Timeless. And I found myself in a conversation with Mark Hamill, with Luke Skywalker, of all people, on an airplane about how he loved Timeless. There is something about the genre world that just inspires such passion with people. I don't fully understand it, but God, I love it with Timeless. And there's something about these shows that transport you away from what sucks about this corporal life we live in, and transports you to someplace better, and you don't want that better place to go away. And I remember I was so young when Star Trek was canceled. I certainly don't remember it, and I discovered Star Trek in repeats later on. but there's something about those shows as opposed to cop shows or other things that people can acknowledge. Oh, I really enjoyed that. But it's not something that feels essential in my life. And there's lots of people for whom Timeless felt essential in their lives.
It's interesting because I've thought about this a lot as a diehard genre fan, and I think that there's something. It fills a space, especially in a modern secular society, almost of religion and myth, and that when you look at the Marvel movies doing as well as they do, and you look at all of the top box office movies almost, even adjusted for inflation, with the exception of like Gone with the Wind and Titanic, which are historical epics. And most of the things that make the most money, that have the most passionate fans, that stand the test of time for hundreds of years. I mean, going back to Shakespeare, and before that to the Odyssey, and before that to the Bible, they're genre stories. The Bible is the original, like, can we have like a genre element, something that's like larger than life? Like, we want to have some major powers. And I think that there's just something primal in humans that need myth, and that genre fills that, and that Timeless, particularly, I know certainly for me, like it fills that, but in a way that feels a little bit more grounded with recent history and the world that we live in. So it feels like it's speaking more directly to us than something else might.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I give a lot of credit to Eric Kripke, my partner in crime, my co-creator on that show. He really is a master of genre. He's got a show on Amazon now, The Boys, is well worth watching if you haven't seen it.
One of my favorite
and he really taught me a lot about writing for genre and what you talk about, the myth of it all, and the role of reluctant hero in all this, and the role of sort of taking on responsibility for the greater good at your own sacrifice, and genre transports us to a place we've never seen before, but really touches the heart of the human experience in ways that we, genre shows us who we want to be oftentimes, rather than who we are. The Shield, I think, showed who we are. Timeless showed who we want to be.
I like that. That is a really beautiful note to land on, and I think that it speaks to two very different kinds of writing that people can keep in mind. Writing to where we are and who we are, and writing to who we want to be. Those are two really strong points of view to come at a story from. So I've got one last question, and this actually comes from my sister, who apparently is watching. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist in Washington, D.C. area. If anybody over there needs some help because you've been cloistered with your spouse, I'm doing an unpaid sponsorship break for that. But she just wants to know if your family feels very proud. Sorry, I don't.
I've lost you. I just got you back. So your sister had a question, and it is.
Yeah, I lost you for a second too. I'm glad that you weren't. My sister says the family therapist in me wants to know if Shawn's family is proud.
Okay, now you're going to get me emotional, which is.
Please, that's the best. That's what she does. That's her job.
Yeah. I lost my father 5 years ago. He died suddenly one night. So I'll tell a story about this. It was around when Mad Dogs, my show on Amazon, was premiering. So I was kind of checking Twitter more often than usual, just because I wanted to see. Because as you said, who knows who's watching things on Amazon and Netflix and Hulu. And by the way, I love Mad Dogs as a show, and it is on Amazon, and you should check it out. It's 10 episodes, and I really love it. So anyways, I was checking Twitter, and someone from my hometown, who I didn't know, tweeted, hey, I just saw your father, and he was acting all strange. You should check on him. And I thought, well, that's weird. And I called my cousin in Rockford and said, "Hey, I got this weird tweet, and I followed the person and DM'd her. I was like, 'What are you talking about?' And she said, 'Oh, I'm at this bar and he was here, but when he walked out, he was sort of talking a little bit strangely, and you just might want to check on him.' So I had my cousin who lives near him go and drive over to his house, and in fact, he was having a brain embolism, and he had driven home and he had collapsed in the front yard of his house, and it was January, 20 degrees, and my cousin found him and he was still conscious, and they called the paramedic. Now, he ultimately ended up dying that evening because there was just too much damage. He had had a heart attack a year before, and he was on blood thinners, and when you have a brain embolism and you're on blood thinners, it damages the brain sort of quicker. But I always look back but he passed away with his sister and his nieces with him in Rockford, in Illinois. And I always thought, if I hadn't been in television and I hadn't created these shows that people watched, a fan who followed me because of that wouldn't have told me that, "Hey, your father was acting a little strange, you should check on him." And he would have essentially died in his front yard of exposure. And instead, I got a heads up, and I was able to call my cousin, and he was transported to a hospital and was surrounded by loved ones when he passed away. And the thing, he was so proud of me and my brother, but the shows, he always used to come to set of the show I was working on at that moment to he always loved talking to the actors and loved talking to the director, and he really loved being the father of Shawn Ryan, who had created these shows. And I think, the only movie I've ever cried at in person in a movie theater was Field of Dreams, which, is a father-son story, right? Every son wants to get the approval of their father, wants to feel like they were raised in a way that made their father proud. And, and the good thing for me was that my father was proud, and I knew that before he passed away, and it's something that I always cherish. So, coming from a place like Rockford, my mother, who's still alive, thankfully, my cousins, I've done them proud, and, it's really gratifying. So screw you for getting me emotional, and I'm going to drink more wine now.
Well, in the spirit of family, I will say that I will totally pass all the blame for getting you emotional onto my little sister, because that's what I have done for most of my life. And she messages that that now she and my folks are emotional too. And that my mom.
I've seen some of the messages. Thank you for that. Appreciate it, everyone.
On that really beautiful note, I want to thank you so much. This is, I have to say, both the first episode of this show that I've done where I was nervous beforehand because I didn't actually know you, and because I am genuinely such a fan, and also the first episode that I felt was what I wanted this to be, a combination of informative for people who are coming up as writers, but also human and emotional for people, and authentic for people who just think that writers are interesting, as do I, because I think that writers are in many ways some of the most interesting people around, and I don't understand why we always put the focus on actors aside from them always being really good looking.
Well, so, that goes a long way. It's culture.
But so on that note, thank you for coming on, for sharing your wisdom and insight and heart, and thank you to everybody in the audience who came on and watched. I'm going to say a few final words about upcoming episodes and a quick message from our sponsors one last time, as you know, because you've been watching and you can see now across the top, which is still new and exciting to me. I'm not sure when that novelty will pass off or pass We've got two wonderful sponsors now for the show, Notes for Execs and Roadmap Writers. Roadmap is an online writer educational platform hosted by working industry executives. And if you're looking for a real-world solution to help develop, market, and sell your script, visit roadmapwriters.com to learn more. Notes for Execs is a company that guides working entertainment executives on how to give better and more effective creative notes. Now they're opening their doors to writers as well, who can learn a lot about their own writing through the notes giving process. And I am also going to get more 15-second spots for those from those companies, so I'm not just saying the same stuff over and over every time. But thank you very much for tuning in, and tomorrow night we have another extremely special episode. Shawn Ryan is a hero of mine as a writer. Liz Alper, who's coming on tomorrow night, is a hero of mine as an activist, and is a wonderful writer in her own right, but she's also a WGA board member who has taken it upon herself to get assistants paid better and to highlight the issue of Hollywood assistants who are underpaid and underappreciated, and has shifted the conversation around those issues more than anybody that I have pretty much ever seen. I think more than anyone has ever done. And so I am thrilled to be talking to her tomorrow about her journey as a writer and her place of prominence now in the writing community, advocating to make things better for everybody else. So thank you to all who have tuned in. Please come back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific to see Liz Alper, whose work you may know from the show The Rookie, and also from Twitter for the WGA Staffing Boost and WGA Staffing Grid and Pay Up Hollywood. Thanks very much and have a wonderful evening.